This is not a test.
This is our future.
Our progress, our opportunity.
This is years of experience.
Our dreams and aspirations.
This is 10,000 hours, and then some.
These are my skills.
Your skills. Our skills.
They make ideas happen.
Create new business opportunities.
Build apps never imagined.
And design devices that cure the impossible.
Because we are not bound by what's possible.
We are the makers of possible.
This is not a test.
Our skills don't come from classrooms.
They can't be defined by empty metrics or archaic systems.
They're refined on evenings and weekends.
Shaped under the pressures of disruption.
The pace of business.
The pursuit of mastery.
So we'll pass on the participation trophies.
The gold stars, the endorsements.
Because we are
the change makers.
The next big thing.
The talent, the skills.
And we know we have the opportunity to change the world.
This is not a test.
This is not a test.
This is not a test.
This is the future.
The new standard for measuring tech skills.
This is Pluralsight IQ.
So thanks everybody for coming. This is a topic I'm really, really passionate about, is migration with Angular. I've spent the last couple of years of my life, I feel like migration has been one of the topics that I have really been doing a lot of focusing on. So let's start off. Again, I just reiterate what Lindsay said. I'm author for Pluralsight. I've been doing a lot of Angular for a long time. I've authored a lot of courses on Pluralsight for Angular. And this webinar is specifically related to two courses that I've put out about migration. One is preparing for migrating your code, or migrating from AngularJS to Angular, and the other one is actually migrating. So two different courses, one where you just do the preparation work, and then one where you actually do the migration. And so I've been doing a lot of Angular, I've been talking a lot about Angular, and this is going to be really exciting for me to talk yet again about migration. I've done a lot of workshops on this as well. This is a passion of mine. Let's look really quickly at the agenda for today. We're going to start off with an introduction and then some concepts. And this is going to kind of be the meat of the presentation today. Is we're going to look at the concepts of migration and give ourselves enough background that we get a good high-level overview of migration from Angular, the old version, Angular 1, to the current version, which today is 5, but we've got 6 coming out before too long. Then we'll look at a migration plan, and this migration plan is a step-by-step recipe. We're going to look at that from a high level and look at each of the steps, but to really get into the deep part of it, of course, it's going to take a lot longer than just a short webinar like this is going to give us time for. That's what the courses are for, of course. And then I'll have a few final thoughts about the whole process. All right, so we got a poll here, right? That's what I'm seeing here, Lindsay, is a poll. And I wanted to get kind of an idea from everybody of what versions of AngularJS and Angular you're using. Again, AngularJS is the old version, version 1.x, and for Angular, if you're on current. So I was interested to see what percentage of people are utilizing Angular in their current applications, and have they already been using Angular 2? Are we going to see these poll results here when we go to the next slide?
Yeah, that's right. There you go.
Okay, so we have a lot of non-answers so far.
Oh. That may be another technical difficulty today. Sorry about that.
Ah, no worries. Okay, well, we're not going to see our poll results, which is too bad. I can speak to what I have seen in the past for poll results for things like this. A lot of people, I assume that you're going to be using Angular. The vast majority of people are using Angular 1 in the applications that they're doing right now. Otherwise, there would be not too much point in being on listening to a webinar about migration. But when we look at what the utilization is like for 2, 4, and 5, we actually see a fair amount of 2 and not so much 4 and 5, and not a lot of people are keeping up to date. I mean, when I say not a lot, I would say we're not talking about 90%. We're probably talking about 50% or better are keeping up to date. Let's move on here. What experience with migration do you have? None, some are extensive. If our polls aren't working, This is
Yeah,
going to be less
can
useful.
You can put those your answer directly in the panel box. You should be able to click on the radio dial buttons within your screen.
Gotcha. Should I wait here for a minute and give people time to put the poll in?
Let's give everyone just a couple of minutes. There may be a little bit of a delay on these polls showing up in your screen.
Should I try going back a slide and see if anything has come through?
No, let's leave this up for just a couple seconds. And then if it's not working for you, you can always put your answer in the chat box as well.
All right. Tell me when you think we ought to move on here.
Let's go ahead and move to the answers here.
I think, oh, we are working.
All right.
Okay. So I'll assume this is representative of the entire audience. It looks like we've got a fairly decent number of responses here. This is pretty typical. And this webinar is detailed towards people who have no experience at all. If you've got some experience, then a few of the things that I'm going to say are going to be reviewed for you, but also I hope that, and you will likely find that I'm going to cover a lot of topics that are going to be very valuable to you, even if you've done some migration. This is like a good high-level overview. So if you've done a lot of migration and have some pretty extensive experience, there'll be a few concepts that we'll discuss here that will be of value to you, but mostly you're going to find the value when you get into the actual course and we get into the real deep part of migration. Let's look at our next poll. Oh, that was it for our polls. All right, we're going to dig into our introduction and overview here. Again, this is going to be kind of the meat of what we're talking about, is the concepts of what a migration is, what it involves, and the different various moving pieces and how Angular itself supports us in doing a migration from the older versions, Angular 1, to the current version of Angular. Excuse me. All right. So before we get into too many of the concepts, I want to talk about the goals of this webinar so you understand where we're headed with this, what the purpose of this whole webinar is, and my goals personally with you, both for this webinar and for the courses that I produced. The first goal is I want to educate. I want people to understand what migration is, what it involves, how much work it involves, get at some concepts of that. I also want to help people create their own migration plan, right? A migration plan, I've actually outlined a 16-step migration plan, but how you actually map this to your use is going to be specific to you. There are a lot of different ways that you can do migration as far as the nuances when you do this step, but really the end result is you need to have your own migration plan up. So that's the second goal, is to help you create a migration plan. Migrating Angular involves a lot of different pieces. We've got controllers, we've got directives, we've got filters, we've got tests, we've got third-party code. We need to migrate all of this when we move our application from AngularJS, the older version, to the current version of Angular. So a migration plan will help us decide when and how to migrate each of these pieces. The next goal for this is to provide versatility. You need to be able to manipulate this process enough to match your own environment, your own application, your own company, the resources that you have available to you. So I'll be talking a lot about varying what we're doing with your own particular situation. Finally, the last goal is to minimize risk. That was a big problem early on when migration was discussed with Angular, is there wasn't a lot of consideration as to, in a big mission critical application that you want to migrate from Angular 1 to the current version, what about minimizing risk, making sure that we aren't making large chunks of changes that might fail and cause the application to either blow up if we were to push it into production, or a change that might take our developers 2 weeks to do. And if at any point in that process something goes wrong and we need to back up, we might be wasting a lot of effort. So minimizing risk really has to do with minimizing the size of each step that we take, so that if at any point we take a misstep, it's easy to go back and we've wasted very little effort. Now, it's worth talking for a minute about vocabulary, because there's some kind of complex, not complex words, but the way that the words are used varies from the words that I'm going to use might vary a little bit from the things that you're used to. So it's good to spend just a quick minute here talking about vocabulary. First off, we've got the old version of Angular. Most people used to call that Angular 1. The official name now is AngularJS. This is the official name for Angular 1. I will often be referring to it as both AngularJS and as Angular 1. We've got the next version, the current version of Angular, which a lot of people called Angular 2. When it launched, it was Angular version 2. Now the official name for this is just Angular. Unfortunately, these two variances, these two words, AngularJS and Angular, are so darn close that there isn't enough of a differentiator that when we talk, especially about migration, when we're talking about both frameworks, they're entirely different frameworks, right? One was inspired by the other, and then it was sort of a natural evolution. The current Angular is a natural evolution of AngularJS, but they are different frameworks, absolutely. So when we talk about the two different frameworks, calling one Angular and one AngularJS ends up oftentimes being very confusing. So when dealing with migration, I sort of default to calling them Angular 1 and Angular 2. Now, Angular 2, the current version of Angular, is actually, again, its version is Angular 5, and we're going to see Angular 6 here before too long, but the current version is Angular 5. So when I say the words Angular 2, what I really mean is Angular version 5. Angular, the Angular framework, but version 5 of it, the latest version, or any version depending on your needs, where you might be at in the, you might be in the middle of a migration and be stuck on Angular version 2. The Angular framework version 2, but whenever I say the word Angular 2, what I really mean is the current Angular framework, not the old AngularJS framework that was Angular 1.x, but really Angular 2. There's a couple of other names for this. Sometimes people call this Angular 2 Plus or NGX, where the X is the fill in the blank for version 2, 4, and 6, but NG or Angular X. That one isn't nearly used as commonly, but when I'm talking, I will oftentimes refer to them as Angular 1 and Angular 2. Next, we have the three words migrate, rewrite, and convert. These three words, when I use them in the context of this webinar, will be specifically referring to, I'm taking an old piece of Angular 1 code and I'm rewriting it so that it is now going to run in the Angular 2 framework. Okay? That's what I mean when I say migrate or rewrite or convert. The reason that it's important to specify this is because the word upgrade in the context of a migration actually has a very specific meaning. The words upgrade and downgrade mean something very specific. So if I ever say the word upgrade, what I don't mean is rewriting any code. Upgrade and downgrade are concepts that allow us to take some pieces of code in one framework. So for example, in an upgrade, we can take an Angular 1 piece of code and we can mark it for use in Angular 2. We don't rewrite it. We're not taking it out of Angular 1. It still runs within the Angular 1 framework, within the Angular 1 runtime, but we're making it available for Angular 2. Vice versa, the word downgrade is the opposite process, where we take a piece of Angular 2 code and we simply mark it for use and make it available to our Angular 1 code. So that's upgrade and downgrade. Upgrade and downgrade don't involve rewriting any code at all. They're simply features that are available to us through the tooling of Angular. And we'll get into this. So if this doesn't make sense right at the moment, that's fine. Just hold on. We'll get into these in detail and we'll see how this works. So there we go. There's our vocabulary lesson for today. And that's going to be really important to remember all these things as we discuss these concepts. All right. When you're getting ready to migrate, you might want to spend some time preparing your code. I've got a whole course that's just on preparing your Angular 1 application to be ready to migrate. You might not want to migrate immediately. Why would that be? Why would you just prepare your code and not actually migrate? Well, there's a few reasons that it's worth it spending time just to prepare your code. One is that your code is going to ultimately be better and more maintainable code, which means it'll be easier and cheaper to do development on that code base and to keep it up. It'll be more expressive. You'll be more productive. Your developers will be more productive. Next, it'll keep you up to date, right? Especially when we're talking of using an older version of Angular. A lot of people with their Angular 1 projects are on an older version and they haven't decided to upgrade for one reason or another. Maybe the difficulty is high, but keeping up to date with Angular 1 is going to be important when it comes time to migrate. Also, it'll bring us closer to a full migration. when it's time to actually do the full migration, if we've spent time preparing our code, we'll be closer, so there'll be less work. All the work that we spend right now getting ready is going to pay off as we actually migrate. It won't be a waste of any time or effort. So then the next question is, why migrate at all? If I've got an Angular 1 application that's running, that's working fine, why should I even bother migrating? There's definitely a few reasons for this, and I assume that you have some reasons already. Otherwise, you may not even be, you likely wouldn't even be attending this webinar. At least you're concerned about, should we migrate? The first reason is Angular 2 is just faster. This is one of the most clear, objective reasons to migrate. Angular 1 is hands down faster than Angular 2, Angular 2 is hands down faster than Angular 1 is. Significantly faster, night and day faster. It was very easy to run into performance problems with Angular 1. With Angular 2, it's a lot harder. You have to write much worse code to run into a performance problem, much more complex code. So that's reason number one, is that it's faster. Reason number two is Angular 2 is just simpler. It has fewer concepts than Angular 1 had. Angular 1 had more pieces, more moving pieces. Angular 2 has fewer moving pieces. Now, don't let this fool you. Angular 2 is a big, complex framework, and it's utilizing a lot of modern technologies, which themselves can make your whole application bigger and have more moving pieces. But Angular 2 itself, its core, is actually simpler than Angular 1. So once you get all the ancillary pieces, the external pieces put in place, your velocity, development velocity will actually be higher in Angular 2 than it will be in Angular 1. So, third, it's forward-looking. It's more standards compliant. AngularJS, the old 1.x version, was built on older standards. Standards have changed today. Angular 2 is very standards compliant, not only for what the standards that we have on the web are today, but also looking forward to standards that are still in the approval phases. Angular 2 also supports features inherently that Angular 1 does not support. Lazy loading is an example. You can, with Angular 1, lazy load your code, but it requires third-party libraries. You can do server-side rendering far easier in Angular 2 than you can in Angular 1. It doesn't mean it make it easy, but it is easier. And third, there's multiple rendering targets with Angular 2, so you can render out to mobile, you can render out to web, you can render out to desktop, and that's inherently supported with Angular 2. So those are good reasons why you should migrate your applications to Angular 2. But one big reason is kind of going back to that forward-looking. In the end, in the long term, you're going to have trouble finding and retaining developers who want to work on older applications. That's as true now as it has always been. Developers want to keep their own skills up to date, and so in the long run, you're going to have a hard time finding and retaining just the talent to maintain an application. So that's a good reason to update as well, or to migrate as well. So you've got an application, you've got really three choices, an application written in Angular 1, you've got three choices as what to do with it. First, you could simply do a whole rewrite. Let's just take the current application, put it aside, or maybe continue to maintain it, but let's rewrite an entirely new application in Angular 2. This has a lot of inherent risks with it, and some of the biggest, most interesting stories that we have in software development revolve around failed rewrite projects. You might be rewriting the application, and now you've got critical bug fixes on the existing application. What are you going to do? You're going to continue to maintain it. What if you need a new feature that really needs to go in, but you're in the middle of the rewrite? You're 6 months from launching. Are you going to add that new feature to the old version, in which case now you have to add it to the new version? And all of a sudden, when more resources are going back to maintaining the old application, and pretty soon the management team just decides to cancel the rewrite. And it also wastes effort. You're writing code, potentially maintaining the first version of the application, and now the new version of the application. You're trying to write that, and you're doing the same thing twice. The second option that we have is just to maintain it. Let's not worry about upgrading it. As we said before, there's some reasons not to. In the long run, you're going to have a hard time finding developers to keep it up, and you're going to be missing out on all those features. The third option is to migrate it. Migration meaning a slow, piece-by-piece process where the existing application is going to slowly move from Angular 1 to Angular 2. As you add new features, it all goes into the one application. We're not trying to maintain and build two different applications. And we can slowly move our application safely with minimal risk from version 1 to the current version, from Angular 1 to Angular 2. This is usually the right answer. For smaller applications, a rewrite can make sense. For more dead applications, keeping them maintained and not rewriting them might make sense, or migrating them might make sense. But for current living applications that need to move on, migration is generally the right answer. It's lower risk, yet generally is less likely to be canceled, and you can be partway through a migration and cancel the migration process and still benefit from everything that you've done so far, and not add any new features, not even finish up the migration, just sunset the application, but you can benefit from everything that you've done throughout the life of while you're migrating. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So we're going to have to dig a little bit into the weeds here and talk about directives. If you yourself haven't done Angular development, this will be a little bit of new content for you. If you have done Angular development yourself, we're going to be talking about directives, which are something you've dealt with before in both Angular 1 and in Angular 2. In Angular 1, we had directives, and we actually had 3 types, and the official documentation didn't talk about this, but it definitely exists, and as we identify these 3 types, if you have done this development, you will recognize these 3 types of directives. The first is called a component directive, the second is a decorator directive, and the third is a structural directive. We're going to look at each of these in detail here. So let's start with the component directive. The component directive, as we see here, this user panel written in red, this is a component directive. Components are all the rage right now. That's what all modern frameworks are based on, is components. We're talking React, Vue, Angular, they're all based off of a component architecture where custom HTML elements are the component. So let's talk about what really makes a component directive, especially in Angular 1.
Audio froze up just for a second there. Could you repeat that last bit?
Okay, back up a little bit. So component directives are represented by an element. They are a common type of directive that we write, and they're how all modern frameworks work. So let's look at what each piece of a component directive is, how we identify what is a component directive. A component directive is represented by an element. As we see here, our user panel element, HTML element, is our component directive. It has a visual template. This user panel is going to have some kind of a display that's going to get put into our user interface. It may not be visible all the time, but it definitely has some kind of a visual display. In Angular 1, a component directive uses isolate scope. What this translates to in Angular and other modern frameworks is that the state of that component is encapsulated within itself. It doesn't automatically inherit state from parent components. We might bring in state from parent components, but they themselves have their own state. With Angular 1, that wasn't actually always true. We could be inheriting and implicitly state from higher up components. A good component directive, though, a proper component directive does use isolate scope in Angular 1. And this is by far the most common type of directive that developers themselves will write, most common custom directive that they will write. They will write custom component directives. The next type is the decorator directive. As we see here, a decorator directive is an attribute that we put onto an existing element. These are far less common for us to write, but they're far more common for us to consume. For example, if we ever listen to the click event, we are consuming a built-in decorator directive. So let's go through the attributes of them. They are represented by an attribute, so an HTML attribute in this case. They have no visual template. In general, there's a few exceptions to this rule, but in general, decorator directives have no visual template. If they have a visual template, usually there's a component directive that works in conjunction with the decorator directive. They should use shared scope. This matters in Angular 1. This doesn't quite translate into Angular 2 or other frameworks. And finally, these are a fairly uncommon type of custom directive for us to build. They're called decorator directives because we're really decorating, in this case, we're decorating the div element. We're telling the div element, hey, I've given you more functionality. They're not commonly called decorator directives when most developers discuss them, because, especially for one reason, that the word decorator now has new meaning, that we use that in both the current version of JavaScript and specifically in TypeScript in Angular. That we use the word decorator means something entirely different. So don't confuse what a decorator directive is with a decorator that we see in Angular 2. But when we're talking about the 3 different kinds of directives, it's nice to have a discriminating word. So component directive, decorator directive, and finally our last type, which is structural directive. This is the canonical example would be like ng-repeat in Angular 1 or ng4 in Angular 2. These are directives that add or remove nodes. They manipulate the structure of our HTML content. They almost are never created by developers, almost never. So the built-in ones just really handle all the cases that we need to worry about, and writing our own custom ones is almost never done. I've run into very few situations where people needed a custom structural directive. So those are the three types of directives. And it's important to understand that because the two that we write, decorator directives and component directives, they differ when we're talking about a migration. So let's talk about that. These are the different code constructs that exist in Angular 1. We have controllers, we have component directives. Controllers and component directives really solve the same problem, which is some functionality, UI functionality associated with a template or some visual display. We have services, which contain our business logic. We have decorator directives, which let us give new functionality to existing HTML elements. And then we have filters, which in Angular 1 are used to either adjust the display of a piece of data or to also filter or sort data. Angular 2 has very analogous concepts to them. We have components. They solve the same problem. Components in Angular 2 solve the same problem that controllers and component directives do in Angular 1. Although really, to be up to date with standards and best practices, what we should be doing is we take our controllers and we rewrite them as component directives. And then that is a far more analogous translation, component directives to components. We have services in Angular 2 that translate very directly to services in Angular 1. We have directives in Angular 2, which translate entirely to decorator directives in Angular 1. They're called directives in Angular 2, although, again, these are used to decorate HTML elements. So there's some funny naming that goes on in here, but it's just important to understand these concepts, what a decorator directive is, whether we call it a directive or a decorator directive, to understand what we're talking about and what it does. And lastly, we have pipes in Angular 2, which replace what filters did in Angular 1. They don't replace all the functionality. They handle the display modification, but when we're talking about filtering or sorting data, we no longer do that with pipes in Angular 2. Instead, we just do that ourselves in our code, usually in the component. So there's our mapping of concepts from Angular 1 to Angular 2. Those are the pieces that we have, and as we migrate, we have to worry about how we migrate each of these pieces. So let's talk about a migration. Migration with Angular is enabled by a library called ng-upgrade. It's a built-in library in Angular 2, the Angular 2 framework. You can bring it in and utilize it. It allows you to run both Angular 1 and Angular 2 side by side on the same browser, and for them, even a given element might be controlled by Angular 1, and the next HTML element might be controlled by Angular 2. That's all enabled through this library called ng-upgrade. But let's first think through what it would be like to migrate if we didn't have tooling support from Angular. So, for example, we've got here two controllers, a user's controller and an order's controller. I'm specifically using controllers to imply that it's an older application, right? Maybe it hasn't recently been rewritten, so it's using a little bit older constructs, controllers instead of component directives. What if we want to migrate this auth service? Well, if we were doing this without any help, the auth service is different in Angular 2 than Angular 1, so we might think we're going to have to rewrite this auth service in Angular 2 and have both versions, because the user's controller, which is still using the version 1, and if we migrate our orders controller to be in Angular 2, then we have to have an Angular 2 service to go along with it if both of them use the auth service. That quickly gets to be a problem where we've got multiple copies of pieces of code. We're maintaining both copies. Long term, as we slowly migrate our application, thankfully, Angular fixes this for us. Let's dig down this rabbit hole just a little bit. Let's say that we've got our orders controller. We're going to convert that orders controller to Angular 2. Right, now we've got that auth service. It's a problem. We might have to rewrite it. And it gets even worse. What if this orders controller has a sub-component, like this order display that was written in Angular 1? If we migrate this to an Angular 2 component, this orders controller, and rewrite it, and it still consumes an Angular 1 component, how is that going to work? Without tooling, this would be a problem. So this is where the upgrade and downgrade process come into play. This is what is enabled by the ng-upgrade library. I can take this auth service and migrate it to Angular 2. Then I simply mark it as downgraded. All that does is it leaves it in Angular 2 and it makes it available to be consumed by any Angular 1 components that still consume that auth service. So in this case, we have the users controller and the orders controller. They're still utilizing the auth service, no problem. We've rewritten that auth service in Angular 2, but we've marked it as downgraded, which means it's still available to be called by Angular 1. Now, if we write a new Angular 2 component that utilizes the auth service, it'll utilize it just fine. They have no problem communicating. Even though I've marked it as downgraded, the marking it as downgraded only applies to when Angular 1 services or components or controllers need to access that service. We can also take our little subcomponent, this order display component, and we can migrate that to Angular 2. We completely rewrite it in Angular 2. It can still be consumed by our Angular 1 orders controller, no problem. We simply again mark that as being a downgraded component. And now whenever Angular 1 encounters the order-display HTML element, it hands over processing to Angular 2, which runs that piece, and the two communicate seamlessly. So that is the power of doing a migration. When we want to do all this by hand on our own, whether we're migrating to Angular 2 or to another framework, we might have the problem of having to duplicate code or figure out our own way to share code with services. But when it comes to like components, that it gets to be really problematic. Angular 2 handles all this for us, lets us rewrite a component or a piece and just mark it as downgraded. So we can upgrade and downgrade both pieces, services, and components. Let's look back again at our mapping chart and talk about the various pieces and whether they're upgradable and downgradable or not. We have controllers, which should be rewritten as component directives. We have services, and both of those have an analogous piece in Angular 1. Then on the bottom half, we've got decorator directives and filters, which have their analogous components, analogous pieces, directives and pipes. The top half is upgradable. We can take any, or downgradable. We can take any component directive, we can mark it as upgradable and able to be consumed by Angular 2. We could take any Angular 2 component, mark it as downgradable or downgraded so that it can be consumed by Angular 1. We can take an Angular 1 service, mark it as upgraded, and then it's be able to be consumed by an Angular 2 component or service. And we can take an Angular 2 service, mark it as downgraded so that it could be consumed by an Angular 1 component or service. But decorator directives and the corresponding directives, and then filters and pipes, they don't have the same features. Or same capability. We cannot mark a decorator directive as upgradable and utilize the Angular 1 version inside of an Angular 2 template. That's not possible. We actually have to rewrite them. Same thing with filters, which is a lot more obvious because filters and pipes don't even quite solve all the same problems. Pipes solve a subset of problems that filters do. In those cases, we have to rewrite these components. We might have to support two versions of this. If we have an important filter that formats our data, we might have to, and we utilize it in a bunch of different components. We rewrite some of those components in Angular 2. We might have to write a pipe in Angular 2 that does the exact same thing and support both pieces of code for a time. Same thing with decorator directives. Thankfully, of all the code that we write, this tends to be a very small percentage of our total amount of code. Generally, the actual number of lines of code that we find inside of filters and decorator directives usually is less than 1% of the entire code base for an application. And each piece is generally a small number of lines of code. Rarely do we find a filter that's doing formatting that has more than 5 or 10 lines of code. Decorator directives as well tend to be on the smaller side. Some of them get to be a little bit more complex, but that usually has to do with their configuration and how they play in. All right. One thing to note is change detection. Change detection has been also figured out with ng upgrade. So it allows us in Angular 1, if we click a button, not only will it fire off Angular 1's change detection cycle, it also fires off Angular 2's change detection so that any changes in Angular 2 components get updated, and vice versa. If we make a click in an Angular 2 component, that fires off Angular 1 change detection. All right, let's talk about a specific migration plan. This is outlined in detail in the courses that I've written. And we're going to go through each of these steps. It's a 16-step migration plan, in which each step may or may not be, if in your own migration, you may not follow each step exactly, or you might skip some of the steps. but this is a migration plan that's slow, careful, steady, and low risk. Oh, we got a poll here. Awesome. What are your migration plans currently? So let's take a quick minute here and let people answer. We've got a few options here. One is you have no current plans right now, or you might plan to migrate your AngularJS to something, maybe Angular in the next year. Maybe you plan to migrate it specifically not to Angular in the next year, or you might plan to migrate your app from AngularJS to Angular in the next year. If it's going to be outside of the next, I didn't actually add a specific option for more than a year, but I figure if it's more than a year out, it's fuzzy enough that we might as well just call that we have no real current plans. So I'm going to give it another second here for the poll for people to fill these in, and we'll look at the results. All right. So looks like we got 40% of people are sitting with no current plans. I assume there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of that could be political. We may not have resources that decide what we're going to do. We have 9%, about 10%, that plan to migrate from AngularJS to something within the next year. And almost nobody's planning to migrate to not from AngularJS to something else in the next year. And then our plans to migrate AngularJS to Angular for sure in the next year, 50%. So 60% of people definitely plan to migrate, and 40% have no current plans. All right. Well, for those of you that definitely have a strong plan to migrate in the next year, or you are almost for sure going to be migrating maybe to Angular in the next year, this will be very valuable to you. For you with no current plans, hopefully you are able to get whatever the roadblock is in your process, whether that's management approval or enough resources to do the migration. Hopefully that will happen. But if your roadblock is really knowledge, then here we go. This is a great opportunity to kind of see what the scope would be like and some of the challenges, but also see how easy it is and how much work has been done by the Angular team to make this process as painless as could be. Really, it's going to be any process like this, especially on a big application. If you're dealing with 100,000 lines of code or 1 million lines of code, it's going to be a big process. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of work and effort to migrate it. But that's true whether you rewrite it or migrate it. But in general, I would say that migration is the best course for you to do. All right, next poll. Concerns. What is our biggest concern for migrating our applications? We got cost, time, risk of downtime or production bugs, or something else. I tried to anticipate what are by far the most common concerns based on the experience that I've had teaching both workshops and talking with people about migration. It feels like cost, time, and risk of downtime or production bugs are the three biggest ones. So let's take a quick second here and allow people to answer before we move on to the results. All right. So cost is only 11%. I actually find that a little bit surprising. Usually when I talk to people, it seems like the cost of migration is a bigger concern. Time, 50%. That makes sense. We're always consumed by time. Do we have enough? I mean, I assume if you're worried about the time migration, you're probably worried about the time it takes just to get regular old application features out. So worrying about how long it's going to take to actually migrate the application, that's a big concern. Risk of downtime or production bugs, 30%. This, even though this only shows up as 30%, I imagine if people really thought, what would happen if we put a critical bug into production because due to a migration error, right? Or something similar to that, that would be a really high priority for people. All right, moving on. Are you lazy loading any of your AngularJS application? This actually matters a lot because the migration is greatly complicated if you are lazy loading. So we only got yes, no, or unsure. Give it a quick second here and move on to the results. All right, 0% said yes. So I find that very interesting. In really big applications, it quickly becomes a problem if you're not doing any lazy loading. It's actually good if you're not doing lazy loading because as you migrate to Angular 2, it becomes easy to lazy load the Angular 2 portions that you build and you migrate. But with the Angular 1 pieces that are lazy loaded, migrating those gets to be really problematic and really requires a lot of digging into deep parts. And I wouldn't say it's a non-starter, but it definitely complicates the migration process a lot. All right, so let's go into that 16-step migration plan. Again, these are outlined in my 2 courses. We're going to go through these fairly quickly and just look at them from a high level. The first 11 steps, I think, or so, these are involved in just preparing our code. So this is when we aren't sure we're going to migrate or we're not ready to start migrating today, but we want to make steps both to improve the quality of our code base and to get ourselves ready for migration. So step 1 is to just follow the Angular 1 style guide. This is something you absolutely should be doing regardless of whether you're going to plan to migrate or not. Step 2, update to the latest version of Angular 1. Probably in many people's experience a problem, but something that does need to be done is you need to be able to migrate or update to the latest version of Angular 1. Then we start doing all of our new development with Angular 1 components. When I say components, I mean Angular 1 components. In 1.5, there was a component function. We're going to do all of our new development. Anything we do new is with components. Then we're going to slowly go back and we're going to switch all of our controllers to B components. If we have any incompatible features in our directives, we're going to, in step 5, we're going to remove those. There are a few incompatible features that we don't have time to cover those here, but those are detailed out in my course. And then we're going to take our component directives. If you've done Angular 1 development, you'll understand there's a difference between a directive that's an element with a template and then the actual 1.5 component. We're going to take any of those component directives that we've got and we're going to migrate and switch those to 1.5 components. That's a really quick, simple process in general. Step 7, we're going to switch to manual bootstrapping. Generally, we use automatic bootstrapping with the ng-app attribute in our application, but we need to switch it over to manual bootstrapping as a preparation for migration. Then we're going to add TypeScript in a build. This can be a big, scary process for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. Just adding, if you don't have a build in your Angular 1 application, adding TypeScript in a little build process is a very small piece. Angular 2 has a build process. It is going to have a build process. So during your migration, you will need a build process in your application. So the days of not having a build process in large JavaScript applications are gone. Next, we're going to start using ES6, or ES6 is sort of a general term for the latest version of JavaScript. There's later versions beyond ES6, but we're going to start using all those features. If we haven't been using TypeScript or haven't been using a transpiler in a build process, we've been missing out on some of the niceties of this. We're going to start using that. Then we're going to take our controllers, any controllers that are left over, ones that aren't component directives, we're going to switch all, sorry, let me restate, I'm going to back up. We're going to take the controllers for our component directives, whether those are the 1.5 components or just directives that have components, they have a controller. We're going to take those controllers and we're going to switch those to ES6 classes, which is why step 9 is so important. We need to be using ES6, and step 8 is important. TypeScript gives us the ability to use ES6. We're going to switch those component controllers over to ES6 classes. That's going to make our code look a lot more similar to how Angular 2 code works and make the migration process simpler as well. Then in step 11, we switch our services over to ES6 classes. Both of these steps make the Angular 1 code a lot more similar to how Angular 2 code works. In Angular 1, your controller for a component could be a function or it could be a class. We want these to be classes. Services, same way, same thing. They can be functions or they can be classes. We want these to be classes. So those are our preparation steps. Let's look at our actual migration steps. There's only a few steps here because there's a couple of steps where there's just a lot of work involved. The first step is we're going to add Angular 2 to our build. This doesn't mean that we're actually running Angular 2 yet. We're just going to make the Angular 2 libraries part of our build, and we're going to build them into our application. If our application does tree shaking, they'll get tree shaken out, but we're going to get those libraries and have the current version of Angular 2 ready for us to start using. Then we're going to bootstrap Angular 2. This is where we switch over from Angular 1's manual bootstrapping to Angular 2's manual bootstrapping. Utilizing Angular, the ng upgrade, will also bootstrap our Angular 1 application for us. At this point, we don't have any code that's in Angular 2. Angular 2. Then comes the big, it's just a few words here on this page, but this is the thing that's going to consume months, maybe even years of time, which is migrating the application piece by piece. There's a lot of magic to this and deciding what pieces to take and what to migrate when and how. This is a big thing, but this is the next step. Then we're going to migrate our routing. I highly recommend that you wait and migrate your routing last, if at all possible. There's a few reasons to migrate some of your routing earlier on, and there are ways to have both Angular 1 and Angular 2's router working side by side, but you run into a lot of problems that way. I highly recommend as much as possible delay your migration of your routing until the end. Then our very last step is once we're completely migrated, we're going to turn off Angular 1. Now let's look at your migration plan, what that might look like. There's a few forms that could take, and there's variations on each of these. One is we're just going to immediately run Angular 2. So tonight, I'm going to go open up my application. I'm going to figure out how to add Angular 2 and bootstrap Angular 2 alongside of it, get that ng upgrade module going. Be running Angular 2 so that tomorrow, if I want, I can start migrating Angular 2. That's a fine plan, and a big application at a big company with a lot of management oversight, a big team. This probably isn't a feasible strategy, but it is certainly one strategy. The opposite side of that is I'm going to spend months preparing. We're going to prepare all our code. We're going to write a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to analyze everything. We're going to do a bunch of spikes where we try the migration, small pieces of it to make sure everything works before we take any steps. This is more appropriate for big mission critical applications. Once we're actually migrated, we have both Angular 1 and Angular 2 running side by side. We call that a hybrid application. Maybe our plan is we're going to get Angular 2 up and running, but we're not going to go back and rewrite everything that's in Angular 1 into Angular 2. Instead, any new development is going to be in Angular 2. And that might mean only new pages are going to be in Angular 2, or it might mean if we ever touch any code, we're going to rewrite that code in Angular 2. Whatever form that takes. What you're saying, though, is that we're not going to specifically make a big migration effort where we know that we're going to be done at a certain time. We're just going to make it so that new development happens in Angular 2. This obviously has needs a lot less management buy-off, but you can still benefit because now developers are able to do most of their coding in Angular 2. We might have a slow ramp up. We're going to add Angular 2, and today we're going to do most of our development in Angular 1, but occasionally we'll pick a piece and migrate that piece. But maybe 80 or 90% of our resources are still developing in Angular 1. Or we might decide we're going to have a complete migration with a certain timeline. We're going to be completely migrated within 6 months. So we have checkpoints at every given regular time frame where we're going to have a certain percentage of our application completely migrated from Angular 1 to 2. Whatever your migration plan looks like, the last one is this is kind of an interesting variation on this, is we don't actually need to finish up and complete our migration. We might leave some pieces of our application as Angular 1 forever. Maybe we've got very stable pieces of our application that aren't utilized very often, they're not maintained very often. We might decide we're going to have those as Angular 1 forever. We're just going to do all the rest of the application in Angular 2. That's totally okay. There's no problem with that. Whatever your migration plan looks like, you need to make it fit for your company, for your political environment, for whatever it is that you're doing, your team size, the size of your application. You need to make sure that your migration plan fits this exactly. It won't be exactly one of these. It'll be some variation off one of these, but your migration plan needs to work for you. So as a few final thoughts, I do want to say that if you've got a big enough application, an important enough application, leaving it alone or rewriting it, I highly don't recommend that you do those things. That you really look seriously at migrating. Migrating has so many benefits. It's something we want to do. Don't let competitive advantages slip away, because by the time that this becomes a problem that you haven't migrated, it's going to be a really big problem. And that's it. We're down to questions, Lindsay.
All right. Thanks so much for powering through that great content, especially when we had a delay to get started. So we're right on time. So I think we have time to take these questions, and we have some really good ones coming through. So I'm just going to throw them at you. First one's coming in from Steven. Any guess on a date for AngularJS to lose their official support? For example, is it going to happen at the end of 2018?
Yes, the Angular team actually just announced it. They're going to release 1.7, and then they're going into a 3-year long-term support. So it looks like 3 to 3.25 years before it loses its official support. Now, if you're particularly worried by that, I wouldn't be too worried by it for a couple of reasons. Even though it might lose official support, they'll just turn it over to the community so that it can be monitored by the community, and people that are still using Angular 1 will still get some kind of support. It'll just become a completely community-driven product. Two, the amount of changes that AngularJS or Angular 1 has experienced recently is so low that even if they didn't support it, it's unlikely that you would run into problems in the future. The web is classically very backwards compatible, so we're not going to get new versions of the web that break old versions of AngularJS applications. I mean, we've got old jQuery applications written 15 years ago that still run just fine. Sure, they're not modern by standards, but they still run. So I wouldn't be too worried about it, but they do have an official announcement for it, 3 years.
Great. Another question coming in. Do I need to learn TypeScript to use Angular?
Absolutely. Fortunately, you don't need to learn very much about TypeScript. There's a couple of simple concepts. In my course, I go over those couple of concepts, but they're very low. You don't need to use TypeScript. TypeScript is very optional for the most part. There's just a couple of places where you need to use it. And you could almost think of that as learning Angular rather than learning TypeScript. But you also will find over the long haul, TypeScript is very valuable, and the features that it gives you are great, and you'll really benefit from in the long run. The learning curve is super low, and mostly it's opt-in stuff, so learning it shouldn't be too big of a deal.
Okay. How should I convince management that this is the right thing to do?
That's obviously going to depend a lot on your own specific environment and your own specific political situation. I would focus on try to figure out what are your management hot buttons. If they are very reactionary and they don't care so much if the developers right now are happy or if the performance is great because the application's performance doesn't matter, then just be forward thinking about it and say, look, in the end, any delay that you make is going to be a problem because at some point, you're not going to have developers who are going to want to work on this. You're going to have to pay more and more and more. The cost to recruit is going to go up and up, and you're just delaying something. Ultimately, you are going to have to migrate. There's no doubt about it. An application, unless you have one of those really rare applications that hasn't been touched in 2 years, if it hasn't been touched in 2 years, then maybe it doesn't need to be migrated. But if it's ongoing, if there's some active development, active maintenance on an application, you will have to migrate at some point. Delaying it is only going to increase the cost.
Okay, here's a question for you. Do I need to rewrite my components to component directives before I upgrade them to Angular?
So that depends on if you're going to migrate them directly. If you're going to migrate them directly, you don't have to rewrite them as components, as Angular 1.5 components. You can just rewrite, like take a controller or a component directive and rewrite it as an Angular 2 component. The value of rewriting them as component directives is you'll find that you're actually going to re-architect larger controllers down to a larger number of smaller components. Doing that and doing it inside of Angular 1 is a smaller, less risky step to when you rewrite it as an Angular 2 component. So let's take an example scenario here. I've seen controllers that are big. I've seen 1,000, 2,000 line Angular 1 controllers. If you've got a 2,000 line Angular 1 controller and you try to rewrite it as an Angular 2 component, you're going to run into all kinds of problems. So you've got to fix that issue with that code. It's just bad, unmaintained, or difficult to maintain code. So you got to fix that issue. So turning that controller into a large set, 5 or 10 Angular 1.5 components, fixes that problem. And then when you migrate each of those components to an Angular 2 component, it's now a much smaller effort. So it really just comes down to, do you need that intermediary step, that low risk step? If you do, then yes, you want to rewrite them as Angular 1.5 components. If you've got well-maintained code that's mostly small, I think a good rule of thumb is 50 lines of code is a great size. If you're looking at code that's 50 lines of code, a controller that's 50 lines of code, or a component, an Angular 1 component that's 50 lines of code, rewriting a component directive that's 50 lines of code, rewriting that as to an Angular 1.5 component and then migrating it to Angular 2 may not give you as much of a benefit.
Okay. Here's a question. With so much churn in the JavaScript space, I think my biggest risk is picking the wrong platform to move to from AngularJS. Do you feel that Angular version 2 point whatever will be the winner?
No, I don't. I think that the days of having a winner are not likely to happen for a while. We had a winner. AngularJS was the winner for a while. It was the 600-pound gorilla. It was by far the vast majority of front-end development that was going on. We are now in a day and age where that's not true. It certainly shares a space with React. By some metrics, React is even slightly more popular than Angular is. It depends on really what you're looking at. In the enterprise, that's definitely seems to not be true. In San Francisco in the startup scene, that definitely seems to be very true. Vue is making some huge popularity gains. There's not a lot of people that are getting paid to do Vue right now, but in this industry, the developers are the tail that wags the dog. What developers want to do tends to be what companies end up doing, mostly because they want to do it, and not so much because it's always the best idea. So we are heading towards a spot where Angular, React, and Vue share market share and have a small amount of variance between the three of them. Will we see the next generation of frameworks? Will one of those become the 600-pound gorilla that wins out? That's possible. Is React or Vue or Angular likely to become the big winner and consume 70 or 80% of the market share? I do not think so at all. Every indication is that they're all gaining popularity, but none of them are taking over.
Excellent way to put
so,
that.
Wait, hold on. I don't think that I quite answered the question, because the question was, I'm worried about picking the wrong thing. I think in this day and age, if you pick certainly one of those three, you're not going to pick the wrong thing. I think when you're migrating from AngularJS, it's a very natural choice to migrate to Angular. It's going to reduce your costs, reduce your risk. So migrating from AngularJS to React or to Vue is likely not to be the smartest decision. But if your team is really hell-bent on React or Vue, then it may make sense to do it anyway.
Okay. So probably time for just a couple more questions. Here's a question. There's actually been a couple questions coming in around this topic. So in a short period of time, we've known several different versions of Angular, 2.4, 5.6, for example. How do you think we should handle those updates?
So far, those updates have been fairly painless. As soon as you get larger and larger applications, you're going to see the number of breaking changes matter. There's been a very small number of breaking changes in Angular as it's migrated from 2 to 4 to 5 and now to 6. So most people are experiencing very seamless upgrades. They're basically able to just choose the new version, and with a small number of changes, even on 100,000, 150,000 lines of code, we're talking a couple of days at most to do the migration, and sometimes just a couple of hours. So generally, the experience has been for most people that those upgrades to keep up to date with the latest version has been fairly seamless. The problem lies in if you do encounter one where it's going to take a couple of days and you delay, you start delaying for too long, and pretty soon you get into a place where you're really worried about that upgrade. So if I was running a development team, I would always push to upgrade to the new version as soon as possible, and to do a spike when we have like a release candidate and check that we're prepared for how big the migration process is going to be. But I would keep up to date because they are adding tons of new features all the time, and getting caught on and stuck on Angular 2, I think is going to be a problem, and you're going to miss out on a lot of features.
Okay, I think this is probably going to be our last question, unless you see one that you really want to get to. Would you recommend a hybrid Angular framework where a portion of the app is running on Angular 1 as we gradually migrate the app to Angular 2?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a lot safer than any alternatives. And that's really what these courses and what this webinar is about, is that kind of a scenario. We want a hybrid application. We got Angular 1 and Angular 2 running side by side, and we slowly move those pieces. Other scenarios, which there are a few, there's an iframe scenario. If you have some particular problems with the current migration, check out Asim Hussain. He has this iframe technique that he utilizes that works in any scenario, regardless of what you've done to you. There are things you can do to your Angular 1 code that make migration difficult, extremely difficult. So there are other techniques, but if at all possible, this is by far the safest, least risk method, is to run the two applications, the two frameworks side by side in a hybrid application, Angular 1 and Angular 2, and slowly migrate each of those pieces from Angular 1 to Angular 2.
Okay, awesome. So we had some amazing questions come in. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them. Even if we had started the webinar 20 minutes early, I don't think we would have been able to get to all of these questions. So once again, I want to thank Joe for going through all of the content in today's presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And then I just wanted to make a quick point and let everyone know we've just announced the dates for Pluralsight Live, our in-person user conference. And I do have a special offer for everyone for joining us today. We are taking $50 off the early bird price, which is the lowest price that's available to anyone. The code is PSWebGo. That'll get you a price of $849, which is actually $450 off the total price for the year. And the dates for today or for this year's conference are August 28th through 30th, and that's in Salt Lake City, Utah. So we'd love to see you there. Joe, thank you once again. Yes, thank you. And I'm going to leave everyone with a short video, and I hope everyone has a wonderful...
Hey, Lindsay.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Can I inject one last thing?
Please, thank you.
Before you start the video. If you are looking for more information about Angular, in addition to my courses, NGConf is coming up in April. So a whole conference devoted to Angular. It's an expert level conference. There's a lot of content there. If you're considering other frameworks, there's a conference called the Framework Summit. It's coming up in October. So those are places to go and learn more about Angular or about all the front-end frameworks in general.
And where can people find more information about those conferences?
If you just Google NGConf or Framework Summit, they'll come right up.
Great. Awesome. So hopefully plenty to put on your calendar for this year to learn more. Thank you very much.
Thanks.